Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Murdoch, and this is Webinars with Wendy. This is my 300th webinar with Wendy, which is pretty amazing that I have continued on this long. And we have some great guests coming up. We're going to have Celeste Lazarus on the 17th. So that one has already been very popular with the registrations, and we're working on getting Stuart Muir back. So hang in there. We'll see if we can snag him. This webinar is brought to you by the Hay Soaker. Are you tired of the drudgery and mess of soaking hay? The Hay Soaker makes soaking hay easy, convenient, and hassle-free. You just set it and forget it, and it's ready when you are. So go to thehaysoaker.com. That's thehaysoaker.com to learn more about an easy way to soak your hay. So today my guest is Carol Layton, and we met at the PCHP conference in Denver, Colorado in October. And Carol came over and we sat and chatted for quite a while. She was a speaker at the PCHP, and I just enjoyed her company so much. I said, would you be a guest on my webinars? And she is from Australia. So one of the fabulous things about the webinars is we can have guests from all over the world. So welcome, Carol. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and it's going to be fun.
Yeah. So Carol, if you can introduce yourself to everybody, give us your background, how you got into nutrition, and how did you get where you are today?
Oh, gosh, that's a great question, because I think I'm no different to other horse owners, except once I get fascinated by something, I can't stop researching it. I get a bit obsessive about it. So I've had horses for many years, and my favorite thing has been endurance for long distance trails. But it really frustrated me earlier on, sort of like more than 10 years ago. It really frustrated me about how to feed horses. I'd studied other things about horse care, horse management, saddle fit, all sorts of things, hoof care. But the what to feed horses, when I talked to people, they would recommend all sorts of feeds or supplements. There was the garlic, the apple cider vinegar, there was the brewer's yeast. There was a whole bunch of stuff, but the reasons to feed them was very airy-fairy. And being an endurance rider, when I went to events, I would look at what other people were feeding and then essentially feed what they were feeding. At the time, there was a feed that had endurance in its name, endurance pellets. So I thought, well, that must be what you feed. And so that got frustrating, because my background for many years, I've got a science degree. I've been a science teacher. I've been a technology teacher. And I really needed something more than just that. And, for example, sometimes they'd say with a supplement that, you've got to feed, rose hips or garlic or whatever it might be, because it improves blood circulation. But in my head, I'm thinking, well, you can run up a hill and do that. What does that actually mean? I was looking for a good answer. I wasn't got the walls up. I'm very open to new suggestions, but no one could tell me. And essentially what I worked out is that if you repeat something often enough and enough people repeat it, it just becomes a thing, and it may have no basis at all. So more than 10 years ago, I started looking for an equine nutrition course where I could really sink into it. I mean, not just being told what to feed, but also the research behind it, so I could verify what was being taught. And of course, that led me to Dr Eleanor Kellon, who's in your country, who is just brilliant, because that's what she provides. So here's a bit of a plug for Dr Kellon and NRCPlus for anyone who wants to learn. And of course, she's got lots of other courses. So I followed that. Now, this was only about my own horses. And so from what I learned about balancing intakes, pasture testing, hay testing, getting it right as far as we possibly can, it just produced such outstanding results in my horses that other people started asking me for their help, and it's just ballooned from there.
Awesome. So, it's so fascinating to listen to everybody's stories, because it's almost always, something like that you start down a path and suddenly there's just this investigation and it leads you on to something new and creates a career. I had a hammer the other night with 4 of her trimmers, and, none of them intended to be trimmers.
Yeah. And you get hooked. You get totally and utterly hooked. And after all these years, I still find equine nutrition is so fascinating, and there's so many layers to it. But of course, the dark side is also all the unsubstantiated and pretty baseless claims that are made. So there's the dark side, but there's also this wonderful sense that you can get results just by following the science. It's amazing.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think you have a presentation for us this evening.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, you asked me what I'd like to talk about, and of the myriad number of topics I could have chosen, I thought I'd start with something that's close to my heart at the moment, because it's been wonderful to see that horse training, horse care is going, to me, it's a new change, new paradigm, horsemanship, where it's a lot more about putting the horse first, looking at horses holistically, looking at it from an emotional point of view, like taking into a lot of things into perspective. But one of the little chinks in the whole picture, one of those pixels, if I could say that, in the screen of horsemanship that I think's missing in all that woo, is feeding. I don't think it gets enough attention. And certainly when people ask me about horses' anxiety and their behaviour and so forth, what's the best product, what's the best calmer, I keep coming back to basics, which is, well, first of all, how much fibre are you feeding? So today I would love to talk about the importance of fibre, why it's so important for a whole range of things, but including helping horses with behavioural issues and anxiety. So my title about feed horses like they're horses, not cows. And really, to be fair to cows, because it's not actually fair, they need a lot of fibre too. But I think when people think about cows, they think of feedlots and the enormous amount of grain that is fed to cows. So that's where the title came from, and inspired by Katie Watts.
Well, and, I mean, just the title for me is really simple in that so many people want to grow cow grass, and cow grass isn't necessarily the best thing for horses, at least here where I live.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, that'll be another topic, because what we call cow grass in Australia is pasture improved species. Pasture improved meaning that they're going to be very high in energy and very high in like sugars and starch and so forth. But for this talk, and I reckon we're going to get distracted by lots of things.
That's okay. That's where we go.
So fascinating, because well, today I really want to isolate it down to, like, what are you feeding your horse? Are you focused on getting as much fibre as possible into your horse, rather than buying bags of feed that is very high in starch and other carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates, for example? That wasn't what the digestive system has evolved on. Like, it's not suitable for horses, yet we've been doing it for the last few decades, and feed companies have been pushing that message. And I'm not saying feed companies are evil, but like this has been the easiest, most profitable way to sell horse feed. And like, we now have a mountain of research that shows, like, we've got all these people who've done their PhDs to show why fibre, why the natural diet is so important.
Awesome. Well, let's dive right in.
Okay. You let me know when you've got the screen up, and I'll
Yep.
get started.
Okay. It's not there yet. So
Oh, good. I can't actually see this for anyone who's watching, but I know that Wendy is a whiz at this. She'll
you just
have
need
it
to
all
hit
under
your little
control.
screen share button there. And at the bottom of the screen. It's at the bottom of my screen. It might be at the top of yours.
Okay. Oh, do I need to do something?
Yep, you need to share your screen.
Oh, rats. Okay. All right. Hang on.
No worries.
I've done a few webinars, but not enough to really get super duopy at this.
Oh, like I said, I've done 300 now, and it doesn't mean that I go without it.
Who can share? Who can start sharing when someone? Oh gosh, I just get this advanced sharing options.
Well, the green button, it usually is at the bottom. It's between chat and polls. It just has a little up arrow. You did it before perfectly, so I know you can.
It just Zoom seems to give me a number of windows here. And
Oh
I'm
yeah, you have
trying-
to pick your PowerPoint. So when you get that, you just have to choose which one is the PowerPoint that you want to share.
yeah.
Can you
Right.
recognize it from the thumbs?
No, it keeps asking me to leave the webinar, so it's very frustrating.
Oh, yeah, nope, wrong button. So on your bottom menu, do you have something that says participants, chat, and share screen?
You've now completely, the whole screen is completely sure. Oh no, okay, here we go. I'm back into chat.
Okay,
All
so
right,
you need to get out of chat and get to share screen with it's a green button with an up arrow.
I'm scared to close it because it might close the webinar.
Oh, if you close chat, just close it from the upper corner of chat.
Hallelujah. My apologies to everyone.
It's okay.
Okay, so I think you might be, can you see my chat screen, or can you just see the screen now? Oh, hang on, I've got to do share.
Yeah, there you go. Awesome. All done. There you go.
Okay.
You can start it, so it's
Great
perfect.
start.
It's okay.
Right, I'll get rolling.
Yeah.
So, okay. So just to reiterate that I have been quite keen on endurance and been, relatively successful, but really I'm a social rider. I just like a good chat when I'm out there, and, if my horse is going well, my horse is going easily. The thing is about equine nutrition is that we really want horses to do what we ask of them to do as easily as possible. We're trying to make them faster, just make the job easier. And if that makes them faster, then woohoo, added bonus. But that's not the main aim. The main aim is to have a horse that has got the most robust immune system and is able to do what we ask easily. So this is my other horse, Smog, looking rather pretty. So the thing is that in America, and I know, and because I'm familiar to a degree with the American feed industry, but also in Australia, we have a lot of feeds where they're actually called things like Row Talk or Show Talk or Breeder, Biomare Cubes, Grower Weaner Pellets. And that's really helpful when you need to look for what feed to feed, because you can identify it by the title. But I just want to reassure people that it's actually pure marketing. And what is in the bag doesn't necessarily mean that that feed is ideal for any of those like types of horses or activities. Currently, I'm waiting for the first working equitation feed to come out, because that's been a big growing sport. There's a lot of people that are into working equitation now. So it's just a matter of time that will be marketed to them. So as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Kellon has these wonderful courses, and I do recommend those. So let's have a look at the digestive system. So what I'm looking at today in focus is about fibre. And to understand why fibre is so important for horses, we really should start off by looking at how the digestive system evolved. So even though people have been micromanaging horses for a period of time, fairly long period of time, if we go back in history, it's not that long in evolutionary history, not long at all. So how horses evolved over millennia to be vegetation eating horses has not changed. The domesticated horse of today is no different in the digestive system from when horses evolved earlier on, way before people turned up on the scene. So what we should be doing is feeding a diet that is as close to what they evolved to eat, rather than what most people are feeding, which is a lot of grain or oil for that matter. So the two parts, we've got the foregut and we've got the hindgut. And the stomach and the small intestine together make up roughly 35% of the digestive system's capacity. So that means the majority of the capacity in the digestive system is actually in the hindgut. And I think most people know that horses are very dependent on the microbiome, which is made up of a lot of bacteria and other microbes. Those microbes, that microbiome, is really dependent on horses. It's a symbiotic relationship, and it's a wonderful thing. They work in partnership to great success for horses and for those microbes. So the thing is that it can take 2 to 3 days for the remnants to emerge of what's been eaten, 2 to 3 days to emerge from the other end. It takes that long. And I mean, all up, we've got a digestive system that is enormous. It can be around, 30 meters. I think I've got there what it is in feet. Sorry if I keep talking in metric, but this is global, isn't it? So, so the majority of energy, mineral and water absorption occurs in the hindgut, and simple carbohydrates and proteins that escape digestion in the foregut is fermented in the hindgut. So when we say escape digestion, what we mean is if too much of something for the time allowed, for that amount of time, if by the end of that length of time, there's still some of those simple carbohydrates or starch and proteins that have escaped digestion in the that is being broken down, being absorbed in the small intestine, time's up. It goes off into the hindgut, and that's where we can get some issues. So normal digestion, absorption of fiber occurs in the hindgut, and there's billions and billions of microbes which produce the enzymes that break the bonds between fiber and glucose. So this is talking about in grass, plant material. Because if the horses didn't have these microbial populations, wouldn't exist. And so much of their gut health and their health overall is dependent on these microbes. So we want to look after these little guys, if you know what I mean, and help the horse look after them. So the end product of fermentation, one of the key end products is actually energy, which is really interesting. A lot of us think that to make our performance horse be more energetic or improve the performance or go faster and all that sort of thing is just to add sugar and starches. But in fact, so much of that energy comes from the fermentation of fiber. It's very important for sources of energy. So even when those excess starches and sugars are fermented in the hindgut, they result in what's known as volatile fatty acids, which are sources of energy. And it's not glucose. It's not in the hindgut, they do not turn into glucose. So the only way to get glucose from the products of the fermentation is the hindgut is for it to be all repackaged, all redone in the liver. So proteins are digested in the hindgut as well, but they don't result in absorption of intact amino acids. Instead, there will be nitrogen and carbon skeletons. So the presence of food in the stomach is what brings copious high bicarbonate saliva produced when the horse is chewing, and that significantly buffers stomach acid. So I want people to think about that. The more chews, the more saliva, the more buffer for the stomach, and that leads to preventing issues like gastric ulcers. So the longer they chew, the better it would be. And the way to do that is with long stem fiber, grass or hay. And have you ever noticed how after an event or a long transport, many horses will avoid grain and go straight to grass or hay? So, it's what's considered an instinctive effort to buffer their stomachs and relieve gastric spasm. Eating grass or hay will have a relaxing effect on the stomach. So while all the activity in the small intestine is important, extracting sugars and protein, amino acids, the horse's hay or grass spends as short a period of time as only 6 hours in the stomach and the small intestine. And extracting calories from fermentable fiber fractions in the cecum is where you've got the main huge populations of microbes. Did you know that there's actual fermenting microbes in the stomach? It's quite fascinating in horses. This doesn't happen in people because our stomach is very, very different. The non-glandular part of the stomach isn't acidic. And in fact, that's where microbes live there. That's also play a part in digestion. But the bulk, by far, the bulk is in the hindgut, particularly the cecum. So as food enters the cecum, this triggers the content as what is already there in the intestine, stimulating intestinal activity, that motility all along the colon. Now that motility is what vets listen to when they're looking for gut sounds. Like if anyone here has done an endurance ride, they'll be familiar with that as being part of the vet's examination into the health of the horse. Good gut sounds are wonderful. Without that stimulation of food trickling into the large intestine, motility becomes sluggish. When motility becomes sluggish, that's when we can increase the possibilities of types of colic. And contents at bottleneck locations where it's like a tighter area can become too dry. So that leads us to how well hydrated your horse is. Are you giving enough salt? And that can set the stage for impaction colic. So let's move on to the next one. So fibre. So fibre, as I said, provides a source of calories, or another way of putting it, energy, and 50% or more. And I just want people to get their heads around that. The energy yield comes from microbial fermentation. I mean, in the old days, I remember when I was growing up, I would hear all about how hay and grass was just roughage. Just roughage, as if it was like a filler in a pillow. And there's so much more to it. And we have the research now to show that. So never, ever underestimate the value of fibre or forage. So out in the wild without without people making any changes or doing anything, we would expect that horses would have 100% plant vegetation in their diet. So what we should be aiming for is up to as close to the maximum amount of fibre as possible. So horses can't digest fibre. They need to have these microbes. And microbes have a role with increasing the availability of minerals. Like there's a whole range of things that they do. So the total length of the digestive system may be around 30 metres, so it's really enormous. And fibre provides horses with gut fill. Now, when we talk about gut fill, we're talking about that, not just the motility, but literally weighing down the amazing length of small intestine that can so easily become displaced or spasm. And fibre also relaxes the stomach and helps control acidity. You can imagine in the stomach, if we go back there, if you were to fill it with a fibrous matrix of long stem fibre, just imagine that's a matted mess of hay and grass. If you've ever had to do a pasture test and you're trying to push grass, long stem grass into a microwave, it's hilarious. It just goes everywhere. You just can't tame the beast. So, you cut it up into small pieces and then you can contain it and stick it in the microwave. But the thing is, when that fibrous matrix, that long stem fibrous matrix is in the stomach, it actually prevents the acidity in the stomach from splashing up on those non-glandular walls. So that's part of the very importance of why it's so, we need to have this fibre coming in at all times when they're eating. So I think I was up to, okay, the other thing, fibre is able to soak up and hold water in the gut, acting as a water reserve. I don't think I hear enough about this. This is actually really important, especially for performance horses or horses that are being transported, or in Australia we would call floated in floats. That, transport is a very hot environment. Horses dehydrate enormously. They sweat a lot when they're being transported, or if they're in work, they're out, being worked, and they don't have access, or they don't have the ability to just go and get a drink. This fibre acts, soaks up and then holds water in the gut and acts as a water reserve. So there's actual research studies that have shown that horses, say, on a hay intake took longer to dehydrate when fasted versus horses that were on 50-50 hay and grain. And it was a matter of hours, like a difference in the number of hours, something like 11 hours to 8 hours. That's the fact that they had all hay versus hay and grain. It took much longer for those horses to dehydrate. So, and the same thing happens for water retention's even better if you include beet pulp or soybean hulls, you know, like, and you make up a mash, of course, they ideally should be soaked so they absorb the water and they become a mash. Compared to, so if you were feeding that with hay compared to hay only intakes. So yeah, like it's something, what do you think, Wendy? Do you hear much about that?
You know, the hydration is something that I've been kind of interested in, you know, largely because of the hay soaker. I have a client that soaks the hay for all of her advanced event horses, and it's the hydration. You want them to have a lot of water, right? And if you're feeding dry matter, it just helps make sure that there's more volume, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think anyone who's watched like if you watch horses eating grass, so my horses are all, we've got heaps of grass where I am here in the Barrington Tops of New South Wales in Australia, no end of grass. And so they'll be out eating grass, they'll, you know, periodically go over to the water trough and drink. But if I had to put a horse in, say, my yard, my round yard, which has got next to no grass, and I'm feeding hay instead, big difference in water intake there, because hay obviously is dehydrated grass. That's all it is. It's just right. Hay has got less moisture than what grass has. And so, yeah, that's a really good point. So anything we can to improve the hydration of horses, and of course, along with that is very important is salt intake. But yeah, so those three are the key importance of fibre. And you just simply can't treat a horse as being different to what it was like when it roamed the earth without people involved. So some really interesting things about the microbiome, which I find endlessly fascinating. As you can see, by 1 year old, the proportion of those cells that are horse cells will fall to around 10%, because literally the rest of it is all the microbes that are populating the parts of the gut or on the surface of the skin. Like it's a really busy, crowded place. And that goes for us too. If you've ever seen those graphics or those images of how crowded the populations are on our skin, and they're not necessarily bad. We're talking about the good guys here. We need this to survive. We have to have fermentation to a degree in our digestive system too. It's just that the horse is being a trickle feeding hind gut fermenter, absolutely reliant. So the interesting thing is that, yeah, 1 gram of hind gut contents contains more bacteria than the total number of humans on the planet. Fascinating stuff. So, and also something that is easily forgotten is that when those microbes die, they are food for the horse, providing a lot of nutrients and energy.
I am fascinated by the fact that the horse has no bacteria in its gut when it's born. Is that right? Did I?
Yeah, sterile. It's incredible, isn't it? It's actually sterile when it comes out of, when the horse is being born, coming out of the womb. And you know what the foal has to eat manure to populate the gut. Like that is a really important behavior. And of course, there's a lot of research going on about people in human medicine and including horses, that if there are, you know, serious gut issues, it can be all about repopulating the gut using various methods.
Yes, no, I know of that. And there's studies looking at the relationship between obesity and the microbiome. I mean, there's a lot of effort going into understanding the microbiome in the gut. Joyce Harmon and I always laugh because we have this one pony in the barn and we're like, if ever we needed a biome, it would be.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Like, and the thing is, when horses are eating their natural diet, and natural, I mean, not woo-woo natural, just out eating vegetation. Let's not complicate things. So it could be grass, could be shrubs, could be herbs, could be reeds, sedges, branches of trees, anything that is plant material, right? I mean, we might say grass just to make it easy, but we actually mean all types of plant material. forage. And by replacing some of that with grain-based feeds, and I'll talk a little bit later, hopefully I'll get to the oil part, fats and oils, we're actually cheating the horse of this fantastic nutrition, and we're going to also cheat the good guys, the microbes in the hindgut, in the digestive system of the horse, because that changes things when we change what, like instead of being all plant material, that is, well, it's all plant material, but unfortunately seeds, like the grains in a horse's intake, normally that would make up a very tiny biomass, like it's only a small amount, but we've got people feeding quite substantial, like many kilos of, you can convert that, many kilos of grain to horses and thinking that's fine. Like most of the feeds in Australia, for example, are based on barley. So even though they've got all these great names and it sounds like they're beautifully formulated for horses, the key problem with them is that they're low in fibre. Because if you've got a feed that is based on grain, it can't be high in fibre. Grain is low fibre. It's just the way it is. So when I evaluate a feed, it's the first thing I look at. What's the fibre content? How maximised is that fibre content? And then let's have a look at what's been added to it. And in some cases, of course, there are feeds like beet pulp, soybean hulls, Intergreen Maxisoy and other feed companies that don't add anything to it, because and then that feed will be, if anything, superior to a lot of other feeds that are way more expensive in glossy bags, because simply they're too low in fibre. All right, so let's see why I'm arguing this so strongly. Why is arguing? Before I move from this slide, I would like to also talk about probiotics and prebiotics, and gut products. There's a big fad now for feeding probiotics or prebiotics and gut health products, which didn't exist that long ago. So prebiotic, an example of that is grass. It's essentially any feed that causes or is food for the microbes in the gut. So that means anything they're eating is a prebiotic, anything. There are some prebiotics that are better than others and so forth. But prebiotics, if they're the food that feed the microbes, then they're the ones that can cause a boom in population numbers of a large number of different microbial species, not just a small number. And then you've got probiotics, and that actually is live microbes in a product. But the limitation with those is that they can only have a limited number of species, and therefore also being in a product, a limited amount of numbers, which is called colony forming. So CFMs, colony forming. So the thing is that my preference is prebiotic to feed what new bacteria and other microbes are in the gut. But you probably, like most horses, don't need these at all if they're just simply on a high fibre intake. Like I see a lot of people spending a fortune on gut products where I'm looking at what they're feeding and thinking, gosh, do you think you could like skip the barley, skip all those other low fibre feeds that you're feeding, get rid of the oil, for example? Because anything that represents a lot of energy means less grass, less hay being eaten. So that's less fibre. What we want to do is help the horse keep his gut bacteria in the digestive system, but in particular the hindgut, as healthy as possible. And the one other thing I should add is that no one product will be a match for every single horse, because what they've found is the microbiome in every horse is individual. They all vary. I mean, you can group them. There's certain categories, like you could talk about like horses that gain weight really easily compared to horses that are difficult to put weight on. They will have a pattern there in their gut microbiome. But when it comes to comparing an individual to an individual, they're all different. And as you can see, they will change, like the bacterial populations and the proportions will change depending on what's being fed. So if you are feeding a fair amount of starch in grain, for example, then the gut microbiome will reflect that. And there'll be more of the carbohydrate fermenting types versus the fiber fermenting. The fiber fermenting are the good guys, if you can put it that way. It's a bit simplistic, but that's the way I'm going to go. So the thing that's really important, though, is that the immune system is linked to the gut. There's this constant exchange of information from the gut microbiome. So, fighting disease, inflammatory responses is very much linked back to what is fed. So looking at the...
Can we just go back to that for a second? Because
yeah, sure.
The way I've always used like probiotics is when I make, when there's been a change, like when the horses have gone from grass to hay because we have winter. So now their diet is really changing because that's always when I've used things like probiotics, is when there's been a sudden change in what they're eating from like grass to hay. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, it can only help, but I personally feel that the best way to do things is you phase a feed change in. If you remember, grass is just grass with a lot of water, like it could be 90% water, and hay can be like 10% plus of water. It's grass, it's still grass, it's just got moisture removed. If you're changing from one type of grass to another type of grass, yeah, that's important too, because that's a feed change. So if you can feed that hay when they're still on the grass over a few days, so you're actually like doing like a feed change from one bag of feed to a different type bag of feed, you're phasing it in, and then you're reducing the amount of grass, you're increasing the amount of hay, and then you go on to full hay. You're giving those microbes in the gut an opportunity to adjust.
How long does it take them to adjust?
Well, the general rule is when you're phasing in a new feed, it's like 10 days to 2 weeks. But I'm sure, depending on what you're phasing in, it could be less than that. So if you were to change, for example, actually a great example is sand clearing. The reason why psyllium and other feeds work to clear sand is simply because the microbes haven't had a chance to adjust. So if you feed psyllium, say, at the beginning of each month for 3 to 4 days, that's the usual recommendation for sand clearing, then because the microbes haven't had a chance to adjust, it just sweeps straight through the gut, hopefully picking up sand. And it does. We know from research that it does. So, but if you were to continue feeding that psyllium, you didn't stop, the microbes would adjust and it would no longer pick up sand, would do no sand clearing as well at all, because the psyllium was being fermented by the microbes.
Okay, but I totally get that it's the gut bacteria stupid. It's like it's like the economy stupid. It's the gut bacteria stupid. But like I said, here in Virginia, like I do phase in my hay.
Right.
And
a lot of people don't.
Yeah, no, I start feeding them because they're out on pasture and I've got where they have to walk, so they're they have to move around, and I adjust the grass as things are coming in and start feeding hay. But it's because my horses live out and I am in control.
Yeah. So but that would be the main thing, is time to give the horses a chance for those microbes to adjust to the new feed. So, yeah, most people know you've got to phase in a new bag feed, but a lot of people don't realise it's still it's the same thing from changing, say, from one paddock to another.
Right.
Like if you go from a paddock where the grass has been eaten out and let's say dormant, let's make it up. And then that moves into a paddock in spring where all this new growth and all the grass is going bonkers. Well, yeah, ideally you would be phasing that in as well, or at least fill the gut with some hay so they're not just going to eat that new grass the whole time straight up. And then if they do eat that, it would be no surprise if there was a bit of diarrhea, because that diarrhea will be an indication of poor fermentation, and it will clear up with time as the microbes adjust. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a big deal.
Okay.
You might even see their manure is a little bit more fibrous, maybe. Okay, so a lack of fibre. Let's have a look at the costs. Let's say you don't, or you choose not to feed a lot of fibre. It's not something that's present of mind. Then this is what you're increasing the possibilities of, because the colic, it's the constant flow of material that stimulates that normal movement or motility. And the gut feel weighs down the intestine and helps prevent those displacements and twists. The horse's intestine is free to move around in the abdomen to a large extent. I've always felt it was a bit of a poor adaptation in horses because they seem to get colic rather easily. I mean, you can have horses on just grass, 24/7 grass, and that there is a chance they could get colic. Maybe it would be dehydration. Maybe they're not getting enough salt. Who knows? But if you want to increase the opportunity for colic, then feed grain that is unnecessary, because depending on what you're doing, I'll talk about that later. All right, so if that gut's not weighed down with sufficient fibrous material, so that's talking about that long stem fibrous material, it may be more likely to twist. And the fibrous matrix of long stem grass or hay will prevent stomach acid from splashing, diarrhea, and lower fibre diets more likely to have loose, sloppy manure. So again, you don't need to go to the shop and buy a gut product. Change what you're feeding. I've talked about the dehydration. It can be that if there's not enough fibre, it can also mean that the horse is more likely to struggle to put weight on, because it's such an important source of energy that is converted into putting weight on a horse. Even leaky gut syndrome. If enough starch is present, the starch-loving bacteria will thrive, producing lactic acid and gas, and of course leading to hindgut acidosis. And, you know, there's all these products on the market to fix hindgut acidosis. And I look at it and I go, hang on, why not feed more a higher fibre intake? That'll help. You know, like, don't set it up and then you won't need those products. But the increased acidity can harm the gut lining cells, and the gut lining becomes damaged, the natural barrier breaks down and toxins from the gut leak out into circulation. So the gas can distend the gut and may cause sections of it to stop moving or float, become displaced, and again leading to colic. So there's all these reasons why it's not a great idea to feed horses like we have for decades, which is like first choice in a bag feed is a grain-based feed. It's not ideal. So bacteria in the gut, the research has shown that these bacteria prime the enormous amount of immune cells lining the gut, preparing them to defend against pathogens and, you know, improve immune system responses. Now, I know this is not horses, but in rats, even in rats, they've been able to find that high soluble fermented fibre feeding compared to low fibre was shown to have an immune balancing effect, more of the anti-inflammatory pathways. And I love this research they've done in mares, because you wouldn't think about fibre and fertility. They've actually found that a high fibre versus low fibre in mares, that the higher fibre increased the fertility. And they've measured that with estrus abnormalities. Like, to me, that's just fascinating. And then the next one is, would you believe time restriction of meals? This is the study. Time restriction of meals and lack of roughage, lack of fibre, have been shown to be a source of abnormal behaviour in horses. And this is what I really definitely wanted to include in our talk today, is these anxiety that horses can have. Not always, because there's a whole heap of factors out there that can contribute to anxiety in horses, which we could cover, but we don't have time. And there's plenty of other people who are much better situated to talk about this. But one small portion of this picture should be about what they're being fed, because we know from the research that behaviours from constant craving, hunger, leads to agitation, can lead to boredom, can lead to, you know, not happy. So, and even lead to sand colic from searching for food. So in the study, they put horses, one group in stables, say, or yards that were in a 24-hour period just on pellets and the other group on long stem hay, and kept everything the same as much as they can, right? And what they found was, as you can see, that they spent 10% of the time eating the pellets compared to 61.5% of the time eating hay, which makes sense to you and I, doesn't it, Wendy? Like, it doesn't take long for horses to eat pellets.
It doesn't take long for me to eat a candy bar.
It doesn't take long for me either. In fact, I'm disgustingly fast with that sort of stuff, and then I want more. So it's not satisfying when it comes to, you crave more. Anyway, moving on from there. So the standing and the lying down is really interesting. So and the sifting through the floor contents, that need to look for more, like they had the same energy requirement. They should have been full. They should have been happy. How's that for simplicity? But we know through the production of neurotransmitters and hormones, the gut microbiome can influence mood and behavior. And the nervous system of the gut is influenced by the microbiome and in turn influences the brain. So changing the diet alters the microbiome, and that changes the chemical signals reaching the brain and nervous system. Fibre encourages beneficial bacteria in the hindgut. Starch does the opposite. Now, I want to be really clear because I know we've only got a short time. I'm trying to say how important fibre is. I don't want to give the impression that a handful of oats is evil. It's not. Like, that's not the problem. It's more when people are feeding kilos of grain. Now, if people can remember about grains, oats are the safest grain of all. Barley is less safe because you can feed less to get the same amount of starch. And then corn or maize is less safe again than barley because it is much more concentrated in starch. So you've got to feed a lot more oats in weight to be the equivalent in starch of, say, barley, and even more and more for it to be the equivalent of corn. So oats are the safest. So when you have a horse and whatever performance or riding that you're doing, if you think your horse is fatigued, hitting the wall with fatigue, then there will be a reason to add grain to the intake, because that glucose that the starch breaks down into and the glucose that's in that grain will then add to the glycogen, the muscle glycogen. I'll just lift up my massive bicep here, because glycogen stores in the muscle are one of the energy sources for exercise, along with adipose fat and all the rest of it. So it's so important to understand that if your horse doesn't ever feel fatigue, doesn't need grain, a little bit can be great as making a feed palatable and isn't a big deal. But when you're feeding kilos and kilos, would you say pounds and pounds? Yeah, okay. Have a rethink about that. Rethink your approach. Have a look at the bag of feed. Have a look at the back. See what the ingredients are. If we've got cereal grains leading, doesn't matter what it says in the specs, it has got to be low in fibre, lower in fibre than is ideal. So in terms of energy, the thing that is wonderful about the fermentation of fibre, which I love for my endurance horses, is that that fibre is fermented into what's called volatile fatty acids. This all happens in the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. And that volatile fatty acid in particular, one of them is called acetate, is fuel. It's converted into fuel. And that's what makes horses, in fact, it happens to us, like it's a fuel to be able to make us run and breathe and be animated and all the rest to survive. And if it's not needed for energy, it'll be converted into fat in the liver. All are excellent. So that if not needed for energy, will be converted into fat. And that means fibre is ideal for not just fueling a horse in work, but also putting condition onto a horse. Like if you wanted to add more condition on a horse. So let's have a look. what are the feeds high in fibre? So the first two are the ones we've been talking about. If we want to get long stem, that matrix safety net in the stomach and that gut motility, the gut fill, they're your choices. The last three there, beet pulp, and I think I've added oat hulls. So lupin hulls, because in Australia we have wonderful lupin hulls that we use. So hulls means the seed coat, and soybean hulls. These are high in fibre and absolutely ideal. So when I critique a feed, like a bag of feed, and I'm looking at the back, I want to see how much of either beet pulp, lupin hulls, or soybean hulls make up that feed, and if they've unfortunately diluted it down with other stuff. And the more it's diluted down, the less attractive it is.
So, one of the things, and this takes me back to the 80s when I was in Australia, everybody fed chaff, wheat chaff, oat chaff, lucerne chaff. Chaff is chopped up hay.
Yes, chopped up
horses
hay.
would get this big bucket of chaff, and they'd sit there with their grain mixed in with their chaff, so they're slowly getting the starch. But are they still feeding chaff in Australia?
Oh yeah, look, it's a favourite thing, and it's amazing. I was amazed to find out that chaff is not universal or global.
No.
It's only in Australia, but I've heard that there are places in America selling chaff now, which I couldn't tell you where, but there's some chaff in America. So literally, it's just cut up hay, and we use chaff when we add to. So if we're feeding an amount of beet pulp, we'll add the chaff to it. Often it's lucerne chaff, it as alfalfa. Right. And we'll add that because we have a lot of oxalate pasture here, kikuyu, soteria, which blocks calcium uptake. And forms calcium oxalate, unfortunately, a chemical form, and then excreted, and the horse misses out on the calcium. So lucerne, alfalfa is a really good source. And so it's just another way of adding a bit more calcium, because lucerne, alfalfa is a great source of quality calcium. But yeah, I think you have hay cubes, which we have in Australia now. People have seen an opening for that, but God, you've got to soak them, don't you? Otherwise,
you've got to soak them and make sure they
cause all sorts of health issues.
Right, because you can wind up with choke. Right, and we're actually going to run a test about soaking cubes with the soaker to come up with a consistent way. But every time it's every batch is different. You got to figure out your soak time.
Yeah, and look, another option is copra. But
what is copra?
Pardon?
What is it?
Oh, it's coconut meal.
Oh, okay.
It's coconut meal. Quite popular for some people. Look, the thing is, if you're feeding copra, don't feed a lot of it. Certainly, I don't pay any attention to feeding recommendations on the back of bags, because it's like, what do they base that on? Every horse's situation is different. The rest of the intake, nutrient levels, how rich the grass is, energy levels, etc. in hay. But I wouldn't feed any more than, say, a pound or 500 grams a day, because it's really poor quality protein. Like, it's a protein feed. It's like 22% protein. It's similar to alfalfa / lucerne. It's a protein feed, so but it's a very poor protein feed because it's poor in key essential amino acids.
Yeah, it doesn't have a full. What about rice hulls?
Yeah. I think rice hulls would be another option as well. Is that easy for you to get?
There is a feed that is rice based here.
Okay.
I know there's cop rice over in Australia. That was fabulous.
Well, copper rice is rice bran.
Right. So isn't that giving
low fiber, high fat?
Oh, it's high fat.
Well, if any feed based on rice bran is high starch. Hang on, sorry, correction. Well, because it's bran. Rice bran, wheat bran are starch feeds.
Oh.
So rice bran, any feed that is based on rice bran, we have quite a few here in Australia, and I know you've got them in America. Any feed based on rice bran is a no-no. Low fiber, high starch. And if it's rice bran, high fat, not good fat.
Okay, so the hull, the outside of the grain versus the inside of the grain.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Can we go back one here? I got one other question. Well,
sure.
and this is the thing. So, and this is another talk, I'm sure. Okay.
Yeah.
But so many of our horses here can't be out on grass all the time because of the type of grass that we have in our fields. In other words, that's what I was saying is cow grass. It's grass. It's sugars and
Well, look, for insulin resistant laminitic prone horses, the severe won't be able to eat a blade of grass of any type.
Right.
Like depending on what else is happening, there's all these different factors, and this is where the ECIR group, Equine Cushion's insulin resistant group, is just brilliant for looking for advice on this. And yeah, another talk, but like a lot of grass is high in sugar and starch. But for example, this horse in the picture, in the photo there, is not an insulin resistant horse, thank God. You know, like he's not. They're
right. That's what I wanted to point out is he can
resistant
because,
or they're not.
Yeah, some people look at a horse on grass now and all they see is danger, or they look at a field and all they see is danger.
Yeah, totally. In fact, that does my head in when I'll have somebody contact me and say they've got them in a yard, so they're locked up. Like, movement is so important for insulin resistant horses, because at the metabolic level, it changes a horse from being as insulin resistant to more insulin sensitive, which is where we want them to go. So you do anything to stop that movement, you're actually making it worse. So it's the old school way of doing things with these horses, is to lock them up for hours on end. In fact, I met a guy the other day and he was a lovely fellow, but he's in his 80s and he's a country gentleman. And he was saying to me how he locks his horse up for 12 hours with just water.
Oh,
ooh. And he was such a lovely fellow. You know, we're on a learning curve, and that's the old way of doing things. Exactly. And it worked. Either the horse will, if you did it to a pony, you know, can you imagine the lipids, you know, the release of lipids into the liver, and then, you know, that's it, you're dead. But yeah, like unbelievable. But we know why that's bad. We know now. We didn't used to know. We know now. So hopefully a lot of people have got an open mind and are willing to consider change in their practices in managing horses. So if you're in that situation where your horse can't eat the grass, then that's where you've got to go to the soaked hay, and you've got to have what you guys call a dry lot. And then there's other management practices, because insulin resistance is on a spectrum. They can either be severe or they can be low level. And exercise can mean, to some insulin resistant horses, like if they're getting enough exercise, enough movement, that they can eat grass all day. It just depends where they end up on that spectrum.
Right. I just wanted to point that out while we were on that slide.
Yeah, sure. So the thing is, I think most of us are familiar with slow feeders, and the reason I'm mentioning the slow feeders is because if you feed a lot of hay, for instance, it's ideal to spread the ration of hay out into frequent small feedings, and doing that avoids, you try to avoid having no access to hay for longer than 6 hours, preferably 4 hours, all for those reasons we talked about: gut feel, motility, and so forth. And horses with free access to hay or restricted access, so we're not saying no access, we're just saying you're managing the amount, because if you've got a fatty bumba, you do need to manage that, have been found to have a steadier blood sugar than horses which are meal fed. They're not meant to be meal fed. That's the whole thing. Their digestive systems are not built for it. And I think, like, it's not surprising that horses have behavioral and issues for the digestive system, like colic and so forth, when we force them to be meal fed. Like, it needs to, because we've got to keep going back to the fact that they're trickle feeders. Okay, and I wasn't going to talk about that, but I reckon we'll move on, because I wanted to look at some
We'll be here for another hour.
I know. So examples of high fiber feeds, and I'm not saying this is an exhaustive list, but all of these, when I've looked at, okay, beet pulp, soybean hulls, or lupin hulls. What well, how much is in these bags? And here for you guys in America, then here are some of the ones that are going to be high in fiber as well. And again, as long as there's no undesirable additives, if they're high in fiber, they're more likely, not necessarily always, but more likely to be lower in sugar and starch. But the key thing here when I talk about that they're about undesirable additives is that they should be low in fat. So if you're looking at a feed and it's actually got more than, say, 6 or even 6% fat, I'd be picking one that's lower, because we got choices. And of course, one thing I should mention is that these soybean hulls, beet pulp, lupin hulls actually have an energy level similar to oats. They're not low in energy. There's a lot of misconceptions about that. So hopefully we've got time. I would love to talk about why fat is not ideal and is a health issue. In fact, some nutritionists like Dr. Kellon call it a metabolic toxin.
Oh, go ahead, because somebody just...
Okay, we got time to tackle this one. So in the last 30 years, at least, if not more, there's been a big push by companies to feed to feed oil fat to horses. And way back, I used to feed a cup of canola oil or vegetable oil a day because that's what everyone was doing, and it was a mistake. So horses don't have a gallbladder, which is a bile storage organ like us. They evolved on a diet, all that plant vegetation is very low in fat. And what fat they get from grass and hay, they're actually really, really good at absorbing it, which makes sense because it's really low. So they get what they need, as in what, from an evolutionary point of view, the digestive systems, they get by being efficient at absorbing it. And it's worth noting that the fat that they're absorbing from grass is very high in omega-3 fatty acids, not the omega-6. So the omega-3 is associated with the anti-inflammatory part of the immune system, and the omega-6 is associated with the anti-inflammatory part of the immune system. And what matters is that ratio between omega-3 and omega-6.
The omega-3 is
anti-inflammatory. Did I get it mixed up?
You kind of
anti-inflammatory, and omega-6 is inflammatory. So I'm saying omega-6 is associated with the inflammatory pathways of the immune system.
And 3 is not.
3 is associated with the anti-inflammatory. So you need both. You've got to have both. But you don't want an over-top inflammatory response like an allergy, like a wound or an illness, like when your knee gets inflamed, when you damage it. You don't want that to go over the top. Right. You want it to be inflamed enough to help with healing, but not ridiculously inflamed that really gets in the way of healing. So that's one simplistic way of explaining it. There's just so much research that's gone into omega-3s, particularly for people and so forth, but in animals too, because horses are grazers. Like the higher you are in the food chain, the proportion of omega-3 to 6 changes. But if you're a herbivore, like the horse, then what they should be getting is higher in omega-3s compared to 6.
Okay.
So the negatives of too much fat is that it compromises the entire process of carbohydrate utilization, from digestion to muscle use. Look, if any fat from a high intake escapes digestion in the small intestine, like I said, there was only a length of time, moves into the hindgut, it can negatively affect hindgut function by reducing the number of microbes. Remember, we talked about the microbiome reflects what you eat. So they've found in research that fat, whether it's in the form of solid or liquid, fat, oil, doesn't matter, when it goes into the hindgut, it can actually cause the death of these fiber fermenting microbes, which will compromise fiber digestion because there's less of them. So one study used around 16% fat. So that would be 160 grams per kilo, and found it, and found it lowered fiber utilization, less nutrients and energy due to that. Oil can suppress magnesium. absorption by forming insoluble salts if it escapes to the large intestine, carrying bound magnesium with it. And horses fed a high-fat intake showed a decrease in phosphorus digestibility. Like, it affects a whole bunch of things. It's not just a fat lard horse. And a high-fat intake in foals, I love this one, was found to cause lower bone density.
Oh.
Bone mineral content. And studies differ in their conclusions about how much is too much, but horses with rapid small intestinal transport times, you know, it's just swishing through, are more vulnerable. And that makes sense, because if it's going quickly through, it'll hit the hindgut. So we know that long-term fat feeding results in reduced number of mitochondria, and that's where I talked about the animal cell with the powerhouse. So this is energy production. Now, in people, and this is when we talk about muscle mitochondrial function, animal cells, it's useful to look at other animal studies as well. A 43% increase in fat intake had striking effects on the mitochondrial function, so it reduced mitochondria. The authors concluded, because the mitochondria are there for a purpose, right, to produce energy.
People now, that this research?
This is the, sorry?
Is this in people?
Yeah, this is in people, but we've also found it in horses.
Okay.
So the thing is that, well, I'm pretty sure, I'd have to check that, but this study was really clear. It concluded that metabolic changes seen with high-fat feeding are identical to those induced by fasting or starvation. If you think about it, if less mitochondria are needed because there's less of the simple sugars and those volatile fatty acids like acetate to produce energy, there'll be less need for the mitochondria. And what they found is there's less of them. So it's a bit like, if you starve, that's what's going to happen. If you fast, that's what's going to happen. It's like the same thing. The release of fatty acids from body fat depots occurs when blood glucose levels drop, as during fasting or starvation. And this sends a red flag message to curb the burning of glucose and preserve stored glycogen, because you see, you die if you don't have enough glucose.
Right.
Because our brain depends on it. So instead of what they call glucose sparing.
A huge rabbit hole, because the whole idea of fasting in humans right now is that it's very popular.
I've been reading up on that too, because I just find it really interesting. I'm no expert on people, okay?
Right.
And we could go down that rabbit hole and I could share what I've learned from that, but we won't. It's too scary.
Let me see if I can.
Maybe short term, from what I've learned, just briefly, short term probably isn't an issue, but long term, from reading what, you know, emeritus professors of human nutrition have been saying, it's not a good idea.
So to get back to horses, they're not designed to have fat in their diet other than what's available in their browsing.
In plant vegetation, yeah.
Right.
Because the problem is, and I'll get to that in the next couple of slides, the body interprets high levels of circulating fat as a sign of inadequate calories, because the fat is released with fasting and moves to conserve glucose for vital organs. And exercise can override this to some extent, but constant exposure to high fat, we're talking about, say, over a long period, because when they recommend high fat diets, they say that the body will adapt to the high fat feeding, like it takes weeks for it to happen. But constant exposure to high fat will slow glucose uptake and interfere aerobic energy generation in muscles. So hopefully this next lot of slides will help with this.
Okay.
I just want to say, if you want a fat horse, feed fat, like if that's what you're aiming for, that it will put fat on, but it's not a healthy way to do it. And it just seems crazy, because fiber in the liver will be converted to fat. Like, you don't need to feed fat to put fat on a horse.
Right.
Yeah. And so I might come back to that one, because, so let's look at exercise. For perspective, low level intensity exercise like walking or sleeping, which is aerobic, requires oxygen, produces energy with the use of oxygen, typically involves any exercise that lasts longer than 2 minutes in duration, and that continuous steady state exercise performed aerobically. Now, fat is the dominant fuel source. Where does it come from? It includes stores like adipose fat. Like Mike, just grabs a little bit of mine. Here's my adipose fat. And the fat doesn't need to come from the diets, like you pour fat into the feed. You know, it doesn't need that as supplementary fat. It comes from the fat stores in the body. And what put the fat there? Fermentation of fiber. So if we then were to go to racing, dragging extreme weight, then it becomes anaerobic, not with oxygen, of glucose and glycogen. So endurance, if we can use that as an example of something in between, so it's not walking and it's not racing, but it's an in-between thing, uses both fat, glucose, and glycogen. And the work determines what energy sources will be used. So let's say you've got a trail riding horse and you think you've got to pour oil into your feed to fuel your horse. You've got it wrong, because trail riding isn't going to use that for that. As intensity increases, the requirement for carbohydrate burning increases. So fermented fiber produces volatile fatty acids. And if not needed for producing energy, the liver converts to fat, and that fat will be stored intramuscular triglycerides and adipose fat. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that if you want to fuel your horse, ideally, you would be feeding a lot of fiber. The microbes will be fermenting that, producing the volatile fatty acids, including acetate. Acetate will then be used in the mitochondria to produce energy, what we call ATP. Right. And on that, of course, you've also got your sugars and your starch, which is in grass, which is in hay. And if your horse hits the wall with fatigue, then sure, for what you're doing with your horse, you could add some oats. And that will help with, like, you always feed that after the workout, because that will help replenish the glycogen stores in the muscles before the next workout. So yeah, I'm sort of pushing ahead with that one. So if I go back to this one, if you can imagine a simplistic example, the amount of forage is equivalent in energy to grain. I think I meant to fix that. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's the same amount, but you can imagine that you've got, yeah, that's right. Okay. The amount of forage is equivalent in energy to grain. So you only need to feed a small amount of grain to roughly be equivalent to the amount of grass or the amount of hay that you would feed in energy. Like, it would be a much bigger amount. But by doing that small, and that could be fat or oil, but let's say you're feeding that grain, that means, in this simplistic example, that could mean that 3 times the amount of that in terms of the forage, the horse won't be eating. So he will be cheated of those nutrients. If you think about, like, the amount of, say, copper in that grain, in that bag, and you read the amount of copper in there, and the copper that's in your pasture, because you go 3 times the amount of copper, that total amount of copper may actually exceed the amount of copper in that smaller amount of grain. I've seen examples like this over and over with protein in particular. You can actually end up with a protein deficiency simply by feeding too much out of a bag of grain, because it replaces so much of the forage. And that forage per kilogram will contain nutrients. Maybe per kilogram it's lower than what that per kilogram or per pound of grain. But when you multiply the amount of forage to be the equivalent of the grain, you then do the maths and you're working out that you're actually cheating that horse of all those nutrients and protein.
Okay, so if I was to put all this in a nutshell,
yep.
Horses are not designed to eat oil. It's not what they would have in their natural diet. If they
they've got oil or fat oil as part of those omega-3 or omega fatty acids.
Acids and the browsing and what they're eating in pasture. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
So by feeding extra oil, we're actually, if we do it long term, we're actually triggering the body to think that it's starving. So
It depends on how much. So
Okay.
this is where it gets a bit, it depends on how much you're feeding. Like, we don't know how much is too much. If you're just feeding, for example, if your horse is on 50% grass and 50% bag feeds, or hay, let's say, actually, no, that's like all grass, all green vegetation, then your horse will be getting those fatty acids from the pasture, right? Green pasture. If we then compare a horse on hay only, unfortunately, omega-3s don't survive too well with the processing of grass into hay. We then would need to feed, say, linseeds, chia seeds. What do you call linseeds again?
Linseed.
Oh, good. So there was another. Anyway, linseeds, because they are such a fabulous source of omega-3 fatty acids. So you're making up for the loss of that grass, green, fresh grass. So hay, it is ideal to add linseeds or chia seeds, because then you're adding what is missing from the intake. But you don't need to add anything else. And you wouldn't be adding, for example, rice bran oil, vegetable oil. You think of any others, coconut oil. There's a whole bunch of them out there, rice bran oil. Any of those oils are no-nos, because they do not contain omega-3s, which is the whole point of adding linseeds.
Or flax.
That is the whole point.
It is the same as flax, apparently.
Flax, thank you. Yeah, flaxseed oil. Thank you. So in Australia, we call it linseed oil. I think in America, they call it flaxseed oil.
I think I lived in Australia long enough to know what linseed is.
Yeah. Linseed, flaxseed, same thing. So the whole thing is that if your whole purpose in feeding an oil or an oil seed is to replace the omega-3 fatty acids that were lost because the horse is only getting a portion of his intake in green grass or no green grass, then pick an oil or an oil seed that contains omega-3 fatty acids. And that would mean linseed, flaxseed, or chia. You don't have many choices. Now, you could feed canola oil. That's the old way to do it. But canola has higher levels of omega-6 than omega-3. You actually want it that way. Right. So you're not helping the ratio, because at the end of the day, what matters is that ratio, the ratio of omega 3 to 6.
Okay. Does hemp seed oil fit in here too?
Oh, I've looked at that. Unfortunately, like there are definitely some nutritional advantages or features of hemp, but it's it's not higher in omega-3.
Okay. So what would be the ideal 3-6 ratio then?
1.
Say it again.
So omega-3, 4 times the level of omega-6 is the ideal, and how do we know that? Because we actually don't have any study that's been done to establish that. But if we just look at the analyses of plant material, that's the ratio roughly. It can go as high as 20 to 1.
Okay.
Yeah. So
yes, 4 to 1.
Omega-6 is important. It's not like we don't need it. We do. But in feeds that contain oil, it's generally, unless it's been treated omega-3, what we call stabilized, then it'll be omega-6 fatty acids. So ideally, if any fat at all, it's for a reason, which is not because you're trying to make a horse fat or you're fueling energy. Forget that. It's the fiber, fermentation of fiber, that will put that fat on a horse. So your first choice should always be as high in fiber as following. So I've actually got my feeding horses 101.
Okay, so let me just
really
kind of simple. Make sure that we're on the same page. So if you're going to feed a fat, you want to feed a fat that's at least a 4 to 1 omega-3 to omega-6 ratio.
Yeah, preferably.
Okay, and chia seeds, flax seeds, those are all good sources.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's primarily when the horse is on hay, because you lose those omega-3s when you feed the hay, because the dried hay loses omega-3s.
Yes.
So if they were out on grass, then they probably wouldn't need a fat supplement because they're already getting the omega-3/6 ratio that's in the nature of their forage.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So, because right now we're in the middle of winter, we're feeding hay and there's nothing out there. They're picking on dead stuff.
Yeah, like grass, when it's yellow, died off, may have less omegas, and so you might consider it then. But if you've got a horse out on grass and that horse is also being ridden, chances are you're giving a bucket feed when you've finished exercising, or you're feeding every day in a bucket feed. Say the grass isn't enough to maintain the weight, then I would be adding linseeds. I grind them in the blender because I'm making sure that my horse is not missing out on his omega-3s.
Okay. Yeah, because like I feed chia seeds to my horses, and then I use the hemp oil to make sure that any of the powders that he's on, and he's on some for his old horse conditions, are in the feed and get in the horse and don't stay in the bucket. That's what I do that for.
Yeah. Look, another important point, just adding to this, is that if you're feeding vitamin E, like if you're feeding a vitamin E product that is a powder, a solid, rather than an oil. So vitamin E usually comes, I buy vitamin E capsules that are in an oil. Because vitamin E is a fat-soluble vitamin, studies have shown that movement from, say, the digestive system into the bloodstream, fat needs to be there. It doesn't matter what the fat is, it just has to be there. So if you are feeding vitamin E capsules that have oil in the capsule, you don't need to worry because it's already there. Vitamin E in grass is associated with the fatty acids in grass, so no problem. But if you're feeding a solid product that is vitamin E, and there's plenty on the market, well, ideally you would coat that with oil because there's less chance of that being absorbed than vitamin E that has fat with it. Okay. And I should add about vitamin E that ideally you keep that separate from other feeds in storage. Like don't expect the vitamin E level in a mineral product to be as stated, because it's used as a preservative. It can degrade. So ideally you would feed that, you would store it separately. You put it in the feed bucket, that's fine, but you wouldn't store it with other feed ingredients.
Right. So somebody's asking me how many hours of grazing on grass is necessary to get enough omega-3s. But I think you might be heading there.
Well, I think that we need more research, but essentially, if we understand that horses get like a significant amount of omega-3s and 6, like fatty acids from, and by the way, omega-9 fatty acids the horses manufacture, so that's why we haven't really been mentioning those. But the omega-3, so fatty acids in general, there's sufficient in plant material to be like, there's no research that supports the notion that we need to give more. This is for a horse in work, in no work. It's just grazing. But so for what I would say, that if you have a horse that is in work and has to get other feeds, just feed, it's just straightforward. Just don't worry about the number of hours. Don't try and figure that out because grass will vary. Simply just make a sensible conclusion that you need to add either linseeds or chia seeds to the feed bucket to help with the omega-3s that have been lost because the horse is not entirely getting that grass in his intake.
Okay, moving on.
Okay, so if we've got time.
How
are we going for time? Would you like us to continue? What do you think, Wendy?
Well, it's been an hour and a half. And I guess my question is, how long is this topic typically? We know that everything's going to go longer with the two of us.
Well, how about I just do this very quickly? And
then we can always have you come back.
Yeah, sure. So feeding horses 101, it's almost like a summary too. So this is your number one. This is the ideal. Because the thing is, one of the things I should have mentioned earlier is that all the B vitamins are manufactured by microbes through the fermentation of fibre. All the B vitamins, every single one. So, and then you don't have enough grass, or it's not high enough in energy level for what your horses are doing, then we can hay chaff or hay cubes and so forth. And then if that's not enough, and I mean, there's a study where they just fed hay to standardbreds, racing standardbreds, and found that they did really well. So that was interesting.
That is interesting.
Yeah, so a high fibre feed, as I've talked about. And then if horse hits the wall, bit of fatigue, then certainly some oats is ideal to help with replenishing those glycogen stores in the muscles. And in fact, I should say that combining, say, one of those high fibre feeds 1-to-1, whether it be beet pulp or soybean hulls, etc., with oats, beautiful combination. What I found in endurance is that it provided a steady release of energy. Like at the beginning of the ride, all these other horses would be going mad, you know, bouncing around, bouncing off walls, and my horse would be alert, but fine. And then by the end of the ride, instead of him hitting the wall with fatigue, which is what happened a lot in the early days, he would still have a lot of energy, and we would win what we have here in Australia, like the best condition or fittest horse competition, which the vets grade, because he looked like he could do 80 kilometres or 160 kilometres all over again. Like he didn't look like I did. I needed to find a solution for me. Anyway, so they found that in the racing standardbreds that the forage-only diet did not prohibit muscle glycogen storage, growth or body condition scores, and none developed behaviour issues. So that was a really interesting study. We need more studies like that. Anyway, and then we talked about oats, and whether it's processed or not just depends on the dental state that the horse has, you know, the ability to break open those hard outer shell. But that can be, I think I jumped one there, so I'll just go back. Here we go. Oh yes, you can see the picture. You see the picture of the manure. Like you can see the seed shell. It's the oats generally have been digested. It's just that the little hard fibrous shell's been left behind. Okay, and then we should talk about another time, minerals and salt, because we know that pasture and hay is too low in copper and zinc from like thousands, millions of pasture or plant testing that is optimal for horses. And sodium is often too low as well. And then we talked about the antioxidants like the vitamin E, and of course that along with that was selenium. And then we talk about the omega-3s and omega-6. That's where I wanted to get to for today.
Yeah, so you know, it comes back to basically pasture or hay.
It really does. And look, I feed, like for the last 10 years, when I was first learning this and all these light bulbs were popping, and I was just going, oh gee, oh wow, oh boy, how exciting is this? Because it was like this wonderful empowerment of finally knowing how to feed my horses. And at the time, it was not how anyone else was feeding their horses. I was all on my own, you know, along with other graduates of NRCPlus and other courses of Dr. Kellon's. And I remember at the time in Australia, the only high fibre feed we could get was Speedy beet pulp imported from the UK. Wow. And it was so expensive. It was ludicrously expensive. Today, because of the gaining awareness or growing awareness of many people about how important fibre is, and these higher fibre feeds, we now have a lot more choices, thank goodness. But in the early days, there was so little. And I think it's just education.
Well, you know, it's really interesting because I just go back to human diet. What do they keep telling all of us that we should increase? Fiber.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
increase the fiber in your diet. So,
Yeah.
there's I can't remember the name of this book, but there was a really interesting, it might've been Breath, where he went back and was able to go into the catacombs in France and look at the skull structure for when packaged food arrived, for when they started canning food, and how the whole facial structure of humans changed as a result of the change in our food source. Yeah, it was Breath. And it's just, that book has stuck with me on so many levels. And it's getting back to how we are designed to eat, not how we have been convinced to eat.
Yeah, there's such so interesting studies. I read this one the other day. Well, not a study, but the work of I won't be able to remember his name, but I just, it was so fascinating, all about energy expenditure. Like, oh gosh, it was so interesting. It was so interesting. It's got so many implications. It was effectively about how in Tanzania, tribes that are hunter-gatherers have the same energy requirement, okay, as somebody in America or Australia working in an office.
Wow.
Exactly the same. Like, this completely crashes that whole thing that if the more exercise you do, the more you need to eat. Because, and he doesn't want, the scientist doesn't want people to think that you should stop exercising because of all the immense amount of health benefits of exercising, when it comes to, even depression, other
Right.
than, all quality of life, et cetera, et cetera. But what he was saying, which I find so interesting, is that the tribe in Tanzania, if you can think of proportions, like the amount of energy devoted to things like fueling the work, the exercise they're doing is greater than the proportion in the people sitting in an office. And that meant that the people sitting in office, a greater proportion of that energy was devoted to more like diseases, inflammatory conditions, like, oh God, it was so interesting. I'll have to send you the link. It was so good. It really blew a lot of things out of the water for me. And it's like, wow, that is incredible. Anyway, it was so good. It was in Science Direct.
Yeah.
Like that's life-changing, I reckon. Sorry, I get excited over things like that because that changes a heck of things. People who have trouble losing weight because even though they're spending hours in the gym every day and they don't seem to be able to lose weight, like that, it helps. This is going to provide an answer for people who've really been struggling. And it makes a lot of sense, actually. Anyway, I'll send you the link.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, it's been really fun and really fascinating, and I'm so glad you have that connection because it's been a good connection the whole time, which is awesome. And we'll just have to have you back so we can continue talking about this. I think nutrition is one of those topics that there's so many aspects to look at. I mean, it's simple and it's complicated all at the same time.
It is, and that's what I try to teach. Like, I'm an educator. What I'm hoping to convey at the end of the day is, like, question everything you're told because there's so much poor information and downright lies out there. And go back to basics. Keep it simple. It can get more complicated. If you really want to go for the ideal, the gold standard is always forage testing and then basing what you put in the feed bucket on what the forage test is telling you is lacking or in the wrong ratio for minerals. But there's help at hand. Like, look up Dr. Eleanor Kellon and her courses. I hope it's all right. I'd like to also say that I'll be doing more webinars with the progressive hoof care practitioners during the year. So you're welcome. I'll be looking at things much more comprehensively. There'll be a whole series of ones, like looking at the performance horse, looking at insulin-resistant laminitic horses, including the Cushing's PPID, and then also comprehensively looking at digestion in the horse in more detail. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and just tell everybody you can find this and all the other webinars on the Surefoot Equine YouTube channel. They are all recorded. It's the #1 question I get. And yes, they are. So please share this with your friends, and everybody have a fabulous evening. And thank you so much, Carol, for joining me tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. It was fun.
It's great to see you.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.